Machin. She's a dad scientist and she's here to share with you a really, really engaging speech on the importance of dads. And I hope you enjoy it and take something from it. Thank you very much. Anna, thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here. Yeah, you have to be called Anna to study dads. It's very important. I'm going to talk today about the myth-busting power of dad science. But I was asked, actually, before I get into the lovely objective studies I'm going to talk to you about today, about my own experience and why I started studying dads 16 years ago. And I think you'll find, actually, quite a lot of people who work in the academic area of dad science do it for very personal reasons, and these are mine. I had my first daughter 16 years ago, and it turns out I'm not terribly good at childbirth, and I was very sick after I gave birth. I had a hemorrhage, and my daughter was very ill and had to go to neonatal care. And it was very, very traumatic. Now, after I'd given birth, I was offered loads and loads of counselling about what had happened. Did I want to talk it through? Was I traumatised, etc., etc. But my husband, who had seen literally everything while I was basically comatose on morphine, wasn't offered anything at all. And even a couple of years after our daughter was born, he was still suffering significant trauma, couldn't talk about the birth, was incredibly worried about having another child, really didn't want to go through that again. Now, we had set off on this parenting journey, as I'm sure a lot of people do, together. You know, we decided we wanted to have children, we planned it, we took the pregnancy test together, we went to the antenatal classes together, we did all this. But actually, once we were in hospital and going through that quite traumatic experience of that birth, he was suddenly relegated to the corner. To the extent that once my baby had been rushed off to neonatal care and I was lying on the stretcher, hardly breathing, all the doctors had left the room, my husband had to ask the guy who came in to clean up the blood whether or not I was dead, because nobody had told him what had happened. Now, I want to say at this point, the NHS is very, very stretched. And I do not blame the doctors or the midwives for the fact that they were very stressed and they had to rush out of that room and go and deal with somebody else. But it just showed me how we treat fathers in this society. Very much as secondary, very much as dispensable. So when I went back to work at Oxford, where my job was to study the science of close relationships, and at that point I hadn't studied the father-child bond, I thought I'm going to look at the literature and I'm going to see what there is about dads in the literature. And whilst there was a lot about absent fathers, and there was a lovely set of work done on young fathers, there wasn't actually much done on the vast majority of dads who actually stick around, divorced or not, and input into their children. We didn't know what happened to dad biologically, psychologically, when he became a father for the first time. We didn't know whether he had any input into development. Actually, the mantra then was he didn't have any input into development. And the mantra then also was that he didn't form an attachment to his child. So I thought at that point, right, this is what I am going to do. I'm going to start from first principles, and I'm going to find out, as an anthropologist, who this important person in our society is, because we had made a major error in not understanding who he was. And so I started at first principles with, in my first study, a group of 15 fathers-to-be, and we went right back to principles. We looked at their psychology, we tracked them from 7 months pregnant up to, at that point, 6 months post-birth. We took bloods, we did brain scans, we asked them about their experiences, we checked their health, we checked their mental health, we asked them about what they thought their role would be, we'd look at how their role changed, we'd ask them about bonding. We literally threw, poor sods, loads and loads of questionnaires at them to try and understand what was going on. And so today, 15, 16 years later, luckily, there's now a big group of us doing this work, and today I'm going to tell you what we now know about dads from the scientific viewpoint. So we're going to talk a little bit about neuroscience, we're going to talk about hormones, we're also going to look at psychology and attachment and child development to try and understand who dad is. Hopefully it's going to appear. Right. When I talk to fathers, men before they become fathers for the first time, I often hear the mantra that they are concerned about how they're going to cope with becoming a parent, because they believe that mothering is instinctive and fathers have to learn how to do it. Now, as an evolutionary anthropologist, somebody who studies the evolution of the human line, I find this a little difficult to take. Because you see, the thing is, human fathers are really, really rare In the mammalian kingdom, only 5% of species have investing fathers, and we are the only ape. Now, just understanding from evolutionary principle, for something like that, something so rare to evolve, it means that it had to be critical in some way to the survival of our species, to the survival of our children. And this is definitely the case, because human fatherhood evolved 500,000 years ago. And if it had not evolved, our species would have died out. So, arguably, fathers saved the human race. Because about 500,000 years ago, our lovely big brains increased in size again. Up until that point, our very dependent babies, you know how dependent human babies are, were being cared for by women, by mothers and their female kin. But 500,000 years ago, our brains increased again. Babies had to be born even earlier to make sure that big brain fitted through the pelvic canal. And suddenly, all that input from your female kin wasn't enough to help you raise that child, to help it survive to adulthood, and to make sure the population was large enough for our species to endure. So Dad stepped in. And at that point, he started to become this very rare thing in the mammalian kingdom, an investing and involved father. Just when I talk about fathers, I want to make it very clear that my definition of fathers is this: it's got nothing to do with biological genetic relatedness. A dad is somebody who steps up and does the job. And we are a little bit obsessed in the West with biological fathers being the real dad, and that's a problem that we have to try and overcome. But I study fathering around the world, and I can tell you this obsession with biological dads is actually quite rare. In many societies, the biological dad doesn't necessarily invest in the child. It's a social father who does. So it could be a grandfather, an uncle, an elder sibling. It could be a mum's friend. In some societies, it's a whole team of fathers with different men fulfilling different roles in that child's life. So we have to understand that when we talk about fathers, and when I'm talking about fathers, when I'm talking about the science we're talking about, it doesn't matter whether you're biologically related or not. The wonderful thing about fathering is many of these biological changes occur as a result of interaction, not simply as a recognition of genetic relatedness. Okay, so this applies to stepfathers, adoptive fathers, whoever social fathers, whoever steps up. So let's get into these myths. So the myth number one is that dads are not instinctive parents, but mums are. So mums, because of pregnancy and childbirth and possibly breastfeeding, if that's a choice that's taken, is the thing that gives you this hit of biology, and that makes you an instinctive parent. You instinctively know what to do. Now, if you're a mum, I imagine you're sitting there going, yeah, right. I know when I had my first baby, I didn't have a clue what I was doing. So I can tell you just subjectively that's not true. But what I understand as an evolution anthropologist is evolution doesn't cause something as rare as fathering to evolve without at least doing something to give the guy a chance of doing it well, to make sure that the genes do survive and go down the generations. And so dads, one of the things we started with 16 years ago is that dads must go through some sort of biological change the first time they become fathers. And it's true, 16 years later we can tell you this, that first of all, dads go through hormonal changes just as much as mum does when she becomes a parent for the first time. In fathers, testosterone is the key hormone, and in new fathers, testosterone drops dramatically. And it never returns to pre-birth levels as long as that father remains in touch and interaction with that child. And it can drop as much as a third. Now, this shouldn't have actually been a surprise to us, because if we look at mammals, if we look at birds, even if we look at reptiles, dads who invest in those species, in those groups, all go through this testosterone drop. And it's really, really critical to making sure that the man or the male focuses inwards upon the family, because testosterone is a fabulous chemical if you want to go out and you want to find a mate. It makes the man much more competitive, it makes him much more attractive to the opposite sex. But it's not great if we want you to stop scanning the horizon for your next mate and focus on the family. So it's got to go if this man is going to invest, and that's exactly what happens. Now, we're still not entirely sure at what point it drops, whether it drops during pregnancy, because certainly in smaller mammals that's what happens, or it drops as a result of interacting with the child. I think that's probably more likely, because that's what happens in the lesser apes who have investing fathers. So we think it's probably something to do with interaction. But the drop is important for two reasons. First of all, men with lower testosterone tend to be more motivated to care for children, and they tend to be more empathetic to the child's needs. So even if you're not a dad, there is a natural variation in men in terms of how much testosterone they have circulating. And we know that men who have lower testosterone, if we present them with a crying baby, are much more likely to pick the baby up, soothe it, be motivated to do that. Men with high testosterone tend to find it incredibly irritating and generally just want to leave the room. So a drop in testosterone is important in terms of motivating you to care and increasing your empathetic abilities. Testosterone also blocks, at high levels, blocks some of the bonding hormones that are critical when we're building that child-parent bond, particularly dopamine and oxytocin. So again, the drop in testosterone is important because it allows the dopamine and oxytocin that is released when you interact with your child to have a powerful effect upon your brain. So we end up with a man who's not only motivated to care for his child, who's not only empathetic to the child's needs, but also receives this wonderful neurochemical reward, which is from dopamine and oxytocin, and a really strong bond with his baby. So that drop in testosterone is critically important. And just to say, this drop in testosterone isn't culturally specific. It's been studied around the world in many, many different cultures with many, many different sorts of fathers, and it occurs every single time a man becomes a father for the first time, as long as he is in contact with his child and he interacts with his child. So that's the hormone change that occurs, and that's one of the biological primers for parenthood in men. Secondly, as you probably all know now, when women become parents for the first time, we see substantial structural changes in the brain. So we see increases in grey matter in the core of the brain, which is that sort of yellow and orange bit right at the middle there. And that's the limbic area of the brain, the ancient part of the brain, which is where we nurture and where we detect risk. So obviously really important parenting skills there. And we see increases in grey and white matter there. We also see increases in the outer areas of the brain, particularly in areas of the brain associated with problem solving, with attention, and with planning. Because obviously as a parent, you spend your whole life solving problems, having to react quickly to things. You want to be able to attend to your baby without being distracted by anything else that's going on around it. So those are important parenting skills. And we do see those changes in women's brains. But we see exactly the same changes in men's brains when they become parents. No different, exactly the same areas of the brain increase in grey matter. The other wonderful thing that we see between fathers and children, and again, which we saw between mothers and children some years earlier, is a thing called biobehavioural synchrony. Now, for me, biobehavioural synchrony, in a way, is the definition of love. I'll explain to you how it works. You probably all know that when you are with somebody you love, whether it's a child, a partner, a member of your family, a friend, you will mirror their body language. And we just have to watch people and we see that. So we have behavioural synchrony. But if we look inside the bodies of those people as they're associating with each other, interacting with each other, we also see physiological synchrony. So things like their heart rate, their body temperature, and their blood pressure will come into synchrony. And then if we look in their brain, we see two forms of synchrony. We see neural synchrony, and that's areas of the brain, the activations that we see also come into synchrony. And particularly in areas of the brain at the front, known as the prefrontal cortex, that's where your social abilities sit. And also in areas of the brain related to a thing called mentalizing. And mentalizing is the ability to understand how somebody else is feeling and what their intentions are. And it's really important when you're interacting with somebody. So we see that come into synchrony. And we also see neurochemical synchrony. Now, there are 4 neurochemicals associated with bonding: beta endorphin, dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. We've only managed to actually do the study in terms of synchrony in neurochemical levels on oxytocin, because it's the easiest one to access. But we also see oxytocin levels come into synchrony. Now, we all exist at different levels of oxytocin in our bodies, but when we interact with somebody we love, when we've got all this lovely behavioural and physiological and neural synchrony, those oxytocin levels will also come into synchrony. And what that means is actually these two individuals, these two organisms, in a way become one organism. They become one person. They are colloquially on the same wavelength. They are, if we're talking about romantic love, soulmates. And it's a really, really critical way of developing a very, very deep bond between two people. And whilst we saw that in mothers, maybe 5-10 years ago, in 2021, it was also seen in fathers. So fathers also come into synchrony with their children when they're interacting with them. What's interesting in fathers, this bit hasn't been studied in mothers actually, and they should go back and do it, is that there is a direct relationship between how the man identifies as a father and how much of this synchrony we see. So if he's the sort of father who identifies very much with being an involved father, he wants to be a hands-on father, he's somebody who spends a lot of time with his child, we see this synchrony very, very strongly. So there's this interesting link between identity and how much you come into synchrony with your child. And for me, as I've said, biobehavioural synchrony really is the definition of love. If you achieve biobehavioural synchrony with somebody and you become that one organism, then that is fundamentally love. So myth number 2, so we've got our biological preparation there. We've got our brain changes, we've got our testosterone dropping, we've got biobehavioural synchrony going on. Lots and lots of biological primers to make this dad as good as he's going to be from a biological point of view at being a parent. Next myth, mums attach to their babies and dads don't. You've probably all heard of John Bowlby, who is the father of attachment theory. And he started attachment theory with Mary Ainsworth in the 1950s. And even he, in 1950s, claimed that fathers did not attach to their children. That the only attachment that mattered or that was evident was between mothers and children, because mothers were the source of care, they were the source of food, they were the source of nurture, and dads just weren't. Now, luckily, we've overturned that, and we now know that fathers do have a strong attachment with their children. But what's really interesting about it is critically different to the attachment that that baby will build with their mother. So I'll just explain quickly what attachment is, if there are those of you who might not understand what it is. Attachment is a very intense bond that develops between two people. With children, it goes in the direction of the child to the parent, so the child will be attached to the parent or the carer. They are developmentally significant, so they will have an influence on how that child develops as an adult. When you have attachment relationships, those relationships have an influence on how you develop as an adult. We can spot an attachment relationship quite easily. The people in the attachment relationship want to maintain proximity as much as possible. When they are separated, we see separation distress, and that's obviously what occurs when babies are separated from their carer. And we also find that particularly babies use that attachment as a secure base, in which they can use that to go out into the world and explore with the confidence, hopefully, if it's a secure attachment, that they can come back to mum or dad and that mum and dad will care for them. So attachment relationships are quite rare in your life, but they are critical to your development. When we look at mum's attachment relationship with the child, what we see is it's one based upon nurture. I kind of look at it as something that's quite inward-looking, it's quite exclusive. The mother will gather the child to them and protect them. So it's very much based on nurture and protection. When we look at dads, we see the same thing. Dads, again, it's very much a nurturing, protective relationship, but there's an added element of challenge. And what's interesting here is what dads seem to do is they build this secure base with the child, so the child feels confident to go out and explore, but they then actively challenge the child to go out and explore. So in a way, rather than it being inward-looking, they turn the child to the world, and they go, right, here's the world. I'm going to help you build the skills you need to survive in it, but I'm going to give you a little shove, and off you go, and you're going to go and deal with those risks and deal with those challenges and build those social relationships, confident in the fact that I'm here, and you can come back. And that difference is absolutely critical, because evolution does not cause two people to carry out exactly the same role if it's not necessary. We don't waste energy like that in evolution. So what's happened is because we've got mum doing all this lovely nurturing stuff, we don't need dad to do it quite as much. So we give dad another role, which is this challenging developmental role of pushing the child out into the world. And therefore they fit together really, really well to provide the full developmental environment. Now, the question that you're all going is what happens with single-parent families? What happens if they're like in a gay or lesbian relationship? This shows you the power of the human brain. Because what we see in single-parent families, or what we see in gay or lesbian relationships with children, is we see that the brain changes to fulfill that role. So if we look at like a primary caretaking gay father, and we look at what they do with their child, they actually involve both of those areas. They do what we would call the mum's role and the dad's role, and we actually see that in the brain. So if we look at the brains of a heterosexual mum and dad, on the left we have the mum's brain, beautifully done in pink, Lovely. And on the right, we have the dad's brain done in blue. But what we're showing here is the peak in activation when that parent is interacting with their child. And what we see is we see differences in peak activation. So when we look at their brains, we do see synchrony in some areas. So they're both empathizing like mad. They're both risk detecting like mad. They're both nurturing. However, the peaks in activation, i.e. the most active areas of the brain, are different when we look at those parenting brains. In mum's brain, it's still a very core activity. It's in the limbic area of the brain, and again, it's associated with nurturing and risk detection. With dad, we see the peak in activation in the neocortex. That's the folded outer area of your brain, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, this bit here, which is associated with social cognition. And the reason for that is because of these slightly different attachments, these slightly different roles. So mum is doing the nurturing and attachment, the nurturing and risk detection. Dad is doing that, but he's also pushing the child out into the world, and that's going to be a much more cognitive thing to do. These differences in peak activation also actually reflect how ancient mothering is. So that sits in the core of the brain, which is very ancient. Dad's is relatively, from an evolutionary point of view, new, 500,000 years old, and therefore it sits more in the neocortex. But we see this difference, and by slotting together, they work. However, if we look at, for example, a gay primary caretaking father, we see peak activations in both areas of this brain. So he has actually, his brain is very plastic, it can change based upon experience. He is actually bringing both of those roles to play in caring for that child. It's not actually been done on single parent families as yet, but we would imagine we would see a similar thing in a single parent family. Because the human brain has evolved very plastic. The most important thing we can do from an evolutionary point of view is raise our children, and therefore if there's only one parent, that brain will change to make sure that that child gets a good developmental environment. Dads build their attachment to their children in a very different way to mums. And that's partly because mums get this wonderful hormonal head start with birth, with pregnancy, and if they're going to breastfeed, with breastfeeding. So that's a massive avalanche of wonderful bonding chemicals, which makes sure mum's going to make an effort to look after that child, even when she's incredibly tired. However, dad obviously doesn't get that head start. So dads build their bond through interaction. And when they first interact with that baby, that can be really hard. A newborn baby doesn't really do very much. It's very hard for fathers to get a look in often, particularly if their partner is breastfeeding, because baby is generally only asleep or feeding or crying or needing a nappy change. And so a lot of dads can struggle with those first weeks. Sometimes they struggle because they look at mum and they see that she's building this wonderful bond and she is the gold standard, and they are failing because they're not feeling the same way as mum maybe is, or they're not finding a way in to do those interactions, and they're also getting very little back from the baby. It's not really a two-way interaction. What I tend to say to fathers at that point is try and find something that is yours, that only you do. Good things are things like bath time or massage, baby massage. We know from numerous studies that baby massage is really good for releasing lots of lovely bonding hormones in both dad and baby because it involves touch. It's also found to be preventative against postnatal depression in men. So one of the things we try to encourage men to do is baby massage, and it can be his thing. As baby matures and becomes developmentally more advanced, obviously you'll start to get a reciprocal relationship. And that's really when the dad-child bond really kicks in. So what I say to dads, because quite often I will get sort of panicky reactions about the fact that baby doesn't like me, or I'm not building a bond like my partner is, or I don't know what I'm doing, is to say you just have to be patient. It will come. All of the dads I've followed have said the bond they have with their child at 6 months is categorically different to the one they had at birth. And in fact, this was even recognised in 1970 by a scientist known as Turner, who actually said there's a two-stage level of bonding in dads. First of all, the one maybe that occurs at birth, which is genetic relatedness, which is like, okay, yeah, you're my kid. There you go. And then you have the second stage, which is built on interaction, which is much more profound, much, much deeper. So dads have to do this, and I think as practitioners, we have to be able to handle their expectations about what they're going to feel like when that first baby is born, and try and do some preventative work and explain to them how they're going to build that bond, and also the fact that there may be a delay, and don't panic. It's going to be okay. It's going to come. Okay. One of the really key ways that dads build their bond is through a behaviour known as rough and tumble play. And rough and tumble play is critically important to the father-child bond for two reasons. First of all, it's an important bonding behaviour. If you've ever seen rough and tumble play, you'll know it's really exuberant, it's really fast, it's really exhilarating, there's lots of giggling, there's lots of throwing children around the room, there's lots of bouncing and tickling. It's really, really extreme. And because it involves things like touch and laughter, you get, again, a lovely avalanche of bonding chemicals from that. So you get beta endorphin and oxytocin and dopamine in particular. It's also developmentally really important because it starts to introduce the child to the rough and tumble of social relationships. If you are playing with someone, it's reciprocal. And particularly if you're playing rough and tumble play, you have to be very good at making sure you are understanding what the other person's intention is, just to keep yourself safe, but also to make sure the other person is still enjoying it, because sometimes rough and tumble play can go too far. And it's no longer fun and actually just hurts. So actually you become very good at reading, is the other person still enjoying this? Have I gone too far? And you start to learn those empathizing skills. You start to learn those reciprocity. It's also quite challenging, quite risky. So you're starting to assess what is challenging, what is risky, how am I going to deal with this risk? And all of these things are starting to help that child learn how to cope with the world. So it's that challenging element. Now, interestingly, rough and tumble play is something that actually we only tend to see in the West. We don't really see it in many non-Western populations, and there's a reason for this. In non-Western populations, many fathers spend much more time in physical contact with their children all day. Particularly in hunter-gatherer societies, there's a lot of carrying of children that goes on, there's a lot of taking children on gathering or hunting expeditions. They don't need rough and tumble play because they can slow down their interactions with that child. They have a lot of time. In the West, it's important because quite a lot of fathers are time poor, and it's a really efficient way of building a bond. So when dads come up to me and say, what is the one thing I can do to help my child or to help my bond, I say go and play with them. It doesn't have to be rough and tumble play. If that's not your thing, that's fine. Read to them, sing to them, do a jigsaw with them. But it's really critical. So sometimes dads get dismissed as the fun parent. Actually, it's really important to be the fun parent. And one wonderful bit of co-evolution, which I absolutely love, is that dads and children prefer each other as play partners. So when we look at what causes a peak in oxytocin release in children when they're interacting with their parents, the peak in oxytocin when a child interacts with their mother is caused when their mother's giving them a right old cuddle. Really, really nurturing them. When we look at what happens with dads, yes, he'll give them a cuddle and they'll get a little oxytocin release, and that's lovely. But the peak happens when they play. And what's really interesting is dads also get a peak in oxytocin release when they play with their children, much more of a release than they do when they nurture their children. So they have co-evolved to seek each other out, to play with each other. So that is why sometimes, you know, when, as a mum, I know my kids come to me when they've fallen over, but they go to my husband when they want to have a really good time. And that's partly because you get this neurochemical release occurring in both of them. So myth number 3, dads play no independent role in child development. Again, when I started 16 years ago, the idea, the philosophy was that fathers played no role in child development. Mum was the environment of development because she was the primary carer. And if dad did play any role, it wasn't independent of mum. He didn't have a special area of development. He would just add a bit on the side. But mum would always be the most powerful influence on that child's development. Now, again, as an evolutionary anthropologist, this made me question this whole idea because, again, we don't tend to get duplication in roles in evolution unless they're absolutely critical to the child. So we started to explore, was there an independent role that fathers took on which was separate to mums in terms of child development? I just want to explain to you very quickly a little bit of the science of child brain development, very quickly, I promise, and the link and why the environment in which carers or parents build around their child is so important. So, as I explained, and as you all know, human babies are born too early. They should actually be in the womb for a good probably 6 months more, if not another year. The reason why they do that is because we're bipedal, and this incredibly massive brain, which we should grow in the womb, wouldn't fit through the birth canal. So we have to birth our babies very, very early. But this means there's a lot of brain development going on after birth, particularly in the first 2 years of life, accelerated brain development. And that means the environment that the child experiences at that time is really crucial for building the architecture of that brain. And we know that in particular, things like parental sensitivity, how a parent interacts with the child, whether they do lovely reciprocity, whether they're very sensitive to the child's needs, or whether they dismiss the child's needs, can't read them, or are, for example, intrusive or neglectful, has a real impact upon the structure of that child's brain. So, for example, if we look at parents interacting with their children, let's say between 1 to 4 years old, so how they play with them, how they care for them, how they read what they need. That tends to have a predictive relationship with that child's brain volume at 8 years. And what we see is where children have a secure attachment to their carer, where they have had sensitive interactions with that carer, we see a lovely amount of brain development, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, which is where your social cognition is and where all those lovely bonding hormones are, and also in the core of the brain, particularly with the size of the amygdala. So the amygdala is where we have risk detection. If you are brought up in a very secure relationship, you'd have a lovely, quite small amygdala, which is not constantly active. So that's a nice, healthy brain. On the opposite end of the scales, if we have children, unfortunately, who've been neglected or abused or have not had a sensitive parenting experience, then we see a reduction in brain density, and we even see neuronal death. And you can actually see in the brain children who've been neglected, and you can see that that has directly impacted their brain structure, which is why those children have a higher risk of going on to struggle in terms of relationships going forward, in terms of mental health, in terms of antisocial behaviour, because they simply have not been given the brain architecture to cope in our lives, in our world. Secondly, a really interesting study is that parental brain density can have an effect upon a child's behaviour and a child's ability to navigate our world. So this was a wonderful study done in 2016. And what they saw was the actual density of grey matter in 3 areas of the parental brain, both mums and dads, had a direct influence on how well that child transitioned from the family into preschool. The first big step as an independent person in the world, going to preschool, really critical. And those 3 areas were the limbic area. So the limbic area is where nurturing and risk detection is. The empathizing area, so that's understanding someone's emotional needs and being able to meet them. And the mentalizing area, which is the ability to understand someone's intention. All really important when you're going to go out into a social world and be a social being. Now, the larger or the more dense those areas were in the parental brain, the easier that child would find it to transition to preschool, and particularly have those skills which enable you to go out into the world beyond your family. Things like emotional regulation, self-soothing, things like pro-social behaviours such as caring, sharing and helping. All these sorts of things that enable you to be able to act and be upon your own. There was a direct link between the child's ability to do those and their brain density. So the environment that a parent builds around their child is critical to whether or not that child can navigate the world. But let's go back to dads specifically, because actually what dads do in terms of a developmental role, which is unique to them, is that they scaffold their child's entry into the world beyond the family. And what that means is they are the key parents to instill the skills, the resilience to deal with the world beyond the family. Because the family, hopefully, is quite a benign environment. You get away with more bad behaviour with your family than you would necessarily at preschool, for example, or at school. People are going to put up with less at school. You're going to have to be good at being social. And dads seem to be the key person for that. Their attachment does that with that added element of challenge, because they're going to push the child, they're going to make the child resilient. But they also do it in other ways. And there are 2 key times when dad's role in development is particularly critical and particularly generally more significant than mum's. And that's when they go into preschool, so that first trip into the world beyond the family on your own as a little person, and during adolescence, when you are starting to transfer your key attachment from your parents or your carers to your peers. So you're stepping even further away from the family and becoming your own person. And there are several key studies that have shown, for example, that fathers are key in preschool in predicting, for example, how well developed a child's language is at 2 years when they enter development. So if we look at structured play sessions which occur between mums and dads at between 1 and 12 months. So we follow fathers and mothers playing with their children once a month, 1 to 12 months. How sensitive the dad was during those play interactions is predictive of the child's language development at 3 years. Mums isn't. Even if we control for absolutely everything, socioeconomic status, if we culture, all of these different things, it's dad who influences how well that child can communicate at that age. And obviously, communication is key to the social world. The other key area is executive function. So executive function is an important skill, particularly for becoming independent of the world. It involves working memory. It involves inhibitory control and attention. So we need to be able to inhibit our less helpful behaviours. If, for example, we get told no, we have to learn that we can't just simply throw ourselves on the floor and kick. We have to learn all these things. But how well a child can do all these things, can attend at school, can inhibit at school, is dependent on dad more than mum. And again, if we look at play sessions between the ages of 6 and 24 months, and then we look at how the child handles these particular skills at school, it is dad's sensitivity that's predictive of the executive function abilities of that child in preschool. What's really interesting, and what a lot of the researchers in this area have concluded, is there's something about dad's role which is about the stimulation of development. And I even see it when I talk to my dads. I do qualitative studies as well as science studies, and I talk to them. And often when I talk to fathers, they're always the one that's looking at the next developmental milestones. So, okay, done crawling, when are we going to walk? Stand up, do this. They are the ones that are pushing that boundary and saying, right, I now want you to do the next thing. So there does seem to be something to do with stimulation of development in fathers. The other really big area is the teenage years, the adolescent years. As I said, that's a really key time of change for teenagers. Not only are they themselves going through structural brain changes, but they're starting to shift their attachments from mum and dad to their peers, and they're really looking for their identity. And dads, because again they scaffold the child's entry into the world beyond the family into the social world, seem to be the key parent to influence mental health, both in teenagers and in young adults. So they seem to have a direct impact on the likelihood of depression in that child, on self-esteem, and on loneliness. And there have been replicated studies showing it's actually dad who is the key person here. And what is the factor that causes a child to be less likely to have poor mental health? It's how much he or she interacts with his father. How much time do they spend together doing things together? So activity is important. Interestingly, self-esteem in fathers, in children, linked to their fathers, they get self-esteem from different things than they do with their mothers. So a child will have high self-esteem if they feel that their mother thinks about them a lot. So I don't know, remembers to pick them up from hockey practice, or which one's their favourite cereal, or organises their big sleepover for their birthday. That's how kids know they are important to their mum. How they know they're important to their dad, and this might be because dads are time poor in the West, is how much time does my dad spend with me doing something together? And all of these studies have found that it's that particular aspect of the relationship, doing something together, that matters in preventing these issues. It doesn't have to be anything particularly fancy. It can be washing the car, it can be taking the dog for a walk, it can be cooking the Sunday lunch. It's just a time that we do things together and we have a chat while we're doing them. And studies have shown, for example, that if a father does that during adolescence, for example, things like as young adults, their offspring will be much more able to deal with stress. Cortisol levels in those teenagers are much lower than they are in teenagers who don't spend time with their parents. And just to finish up now, I just want to explain a little bit about fathering around the world, because I think actually we can learn a lot about fathering around the world. We have fixed ideas in this country, and indeed in every country, about who a father is. Fathers' roles are strongly culturally prescribed. It's partly because they are less tied by biology. They don't go through pregnancy and childbirth and all those sorts of things. But how we view them is very, very cultural, and how we restrict them in their roles is very, very cultural. This, in one sense, can be positive. In fact, they're not as tied to biology, because that means they are the parent that can react quickly to environmental change. They are the ones that can switch their roles quickly to try and support the child. But it also means, obviously, that we get very set ideas about who fathers are. And I think, and I don't know whether you agree, that still in the UK we have quite a poor view, a poor societal view of fathers. Certainly some of the responses I get on Twitter to some of the things I post seems to suggest that. But what we find around the world is whilst dads fulfill their roles in many different ways, and while dads vary in their identity, whether they're social fathers, biological fathers, whatever, they all at their basis have this role of scaffolding their child's entry into the world beyond the family. That's what joins all fathers around the world. They just do it in a different way. And what has been suggested is what constrains a father to their role is partly based upon the level of risk in the environment. What is the nature of the risk in that environment? So this was actually put together by a guy called Robert Devine, and he came up with this idea of how different environments influence how a father actually expresses themselves. So first of all, if we look in a high-risk environment, in a high-risk environment, a dad's primary focus is actual physical survival. I have to keep this kid alive, okay? So we might look at that father and go, well, they're not very hands-on. You know, they're not reading stories or doing rough and tumble play. But to be absolutely honest, if your child is under threat of being eaten by a lion, actually what you have to be really good at is picking the child up and running very quickly to a tree. You don't have to be any good at, you know, solving puzzles with them, for example. So we know that in high-risk environments, dads aren't particularly hands-on in terms of nurturing or caring for their children, but they are absolutely protecting that child from death. In medium-risk environments, what tends to be important is economic survival. So we know the child will probably survive beyond their 5th birthday, okay? But often these environments are marginal. It's very difficult to earn a living. And in those environments, economic survival is what is key. And what you find in these environments is actually fathers are very, very involved in teaching, particularly their adolescents, how to earn money. So, for example, I mentioned the Kipsigis there. They are a tea-growing pastoral group within Kenya. They've been pushed into the margins of the environment by development. And it's very hard to earn a living. They take their children from the age of about 12 with them into the fields. They teach them how to farm the tea, but they also take them to the markets and teach them how to negotiate, teach them how to build the social networks they're going to need to make sure they have people that they can sell their tea to. So again, they're not being particularly nurturing. This is a teaching role, but it's critical to the child's survival, because without that teaching, that child will not survive. And finally, we have Western societies. Now, obviously there is poverty in Western societies, but compared to the Kipsigis, there isn't. And in Western societies, most fathers focus on social and intellectual survival. In our society, what matters most is who you know, basically. If you know people, then you are going to climb up the ladder quicker than if you don't. And so Western dads tend to be involved in things like scaffolding their child's education, so making sure they go to school, helping them with their homework, for example, helping them join football clubs, driving them to football practice, maybe getting them work experience placements, all these sorts of things, to try and make sure, taking them to museums, trying to make sure that they actually have the skills to survive in our very, very complicated social and economic environment. But the thing to take back about fathers is they are highly flexible. And we have to be a little bit careful when we look at the way people father to jump to conclusions about whether they're a good or a bad father. People often ask to me, what is a good father? And I just say to them, very frustratingly for them, it depends. It depends upon what the risks are in the environment. It depends what that child is going to come up against as to what a good father is. Why do I do this work, and why do I come and talk to everybody about it? I do it because I want it to be empowering. I want it to be empowering for fathers because I want them to understand that they are meant, that they are supposed to be here, that they are important, that they are unique, and that they have a role. They are not a secondary parent. They are not a bag carrier. They are supposed to be there. And I do it talking to practitioners because I want to give you the evidence to go out and say, this is why we need to support fathers. And we need to support them not just for themselves, for their own mental health, for their own well-being. We need to support them for our children, because we know fathers, whatever form they come in, have a really significant, unique role to play in that child's development. So I want people to be empowered. I want them to understand that they evolved for a reason. They're here because they're needed. I want them to understand that they are as biologically primed to parent as a mother is. They are as instinctive. I want them to know that they're different from mum, and that's an important difference. They are not a male mother. a dad is a very special role, that they are unique. They bring something unique to the table in terms of child development, that they are really, really diverse. You can father in so many different ways, and that's fine. And I think we need to say to fathers, particularly when they're expecting their babies, what kind of dad do you want to be? There isn't, we shouldn't say this is how you father. And they're also highly flexible, so you can do it in many, many different ways. And I'm hoping that by knowing all this, by using this evidence, by empowering fathers, that we will see change. It's really, really slow. I spend a lot of time campaigning for fathers' rights. I spend a lot of time talking to government and hitting my head against the wall about trying to get support for fathers, trying to get better paternity leave for fathers, or trying to get better recognition in the health and social care services. And I'm hoping that as we keep on trying to do that work, as we get this information out there, as people understand actually who dad is, and we get rid of all the myths, maybe we can change things for the better for fathers and for families and for society. I want to say thank you very much for listening. That's my book. The book it's not an academic book, it's a book written for fathers and practitioners, covering all I've talked about today and much, much more about who dad is. It basically goes along the whole course of a father's life, from prenatal all the way through to the teenage years. And the idea, again, is to tell dads who they are. It's not a manual. It doesn't tell you how to change a nappy or anything like that. It very much is focused on telling dad who he is, answering the questions he might have, explaining to him how he might want to father. And it's been written very much with fathers in mind and with practitioners in mind. And there's some copies over there. They're at a slight discount today, £10 rather than £12.99. The other thing I wanted to say was please keep in touch. Okay, I love to hear about what people who are working on the front line with fathers are experiencing. What are the questions that fathers have? Are there any questions we can help answer? Because we're always looking for new research areas. So either you can get in touch with me via my website, or you can look at me on Twitter and message me on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. My mic's not on now. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you, Anna. I don't know about you guys, but that was fascinating. As a dad, it definitely made me feel like, oh, okay, maybe I am good, because we do think about it as dads, like, oh, maybe I'm not good enough, maybe I'm not that kind of dad, maybe I'm not that, like, doing the same thing as that person, but we all bring our own individual qualities and greatnesses to our kids, so that was really, really helpful. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Can we have another round of applause for Anna? Thank you. So, I think the first question is for Anna Tarrant. So, geographically, do you find there's a difference between young dads in the south and in the north?
No, not necessarily.
Oh, thank you. That was fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Round of applause.
To the point.
Here we are.
No, I wouldn't say it's that blunt, but I am a researcher. And with everything, it's complex. But I think we, certainly in terms of the research, see lots of similarities in how young fatherhood is experienced. There's a lot of difference and diversity, but there are also those shared commitments to being there for their children. Some of the circumstantial challenges they experience are very similar around securing access to housing, dealing with mental health challenges associated with being a young father. But what we do definitely see is kind of place-based identities. That has been a really useful way of engaging with the dads to do the co-creation work. The Grimsby Dads Collective is called the Grimsby Dads Collective because we did a survey with the locality, and the dads very much felt it should be a place-based model. So we're tending to find that place-based models are more effective, and I think that's based on because we're building community in a way that's perhaps not there, and it is not being created by the current institutional setups that we have. So it's not necessarily north-south difference, but more about place-based identity and how that can be harnessed and help to empower young fathers as a collective.
Okay. So would that be to say then that it would work better at a local level than a national, hey, we're just going to do a father's, I think dad's national thing that everybody can get involved in, hooray. And it's better that it's localized people that are around them.
I think you need to start grassroots, genuinely. That's where a lot of the power of this work is. You know, you're really harnessing that shared identity around fatherhood. I sort of talked right at the start of my talk about, you know, this kind of sea change in families and in the way individuals are sort of thinking about being a father or thinking about parenting. As I say, provides a platform for broader policy change, but that takes a huge amount of time, and it takes the buy-in, obviously, of the current government at the time and of services and how they're delivered. But if we build community, we can start from that point and work from there. And for me, that's where we see the real change happening and the real transformation.
Thank you so much. So my mic has to keep coming on and off because there's a slight feedback noise. I don't know if any of you can hear it, but I apologise if it's freaking you out. It is just my microphone, and we're not trying to do any sort of mind control or anything, just to clarify. Good. Okay, thank you so much. Anna, did you have any points to add to that? Or
I think I would just say that I think identity is really important, and I think particularly amongst young fathers, that idea of having a community and having that support is critical. And I also agree, we have to start grassroots, because I'm afraid, guys, our government, not getting too political, is a long way from doing big national campaigns. It's not something that drives them. So I think we do have to start small and empower those fathers, wherever they're from, to actually start asking for change and pushing for change. But it comes from the community first, definitely.
Brilliant. And on that note, actually, this question follows on quite well. From your experience and what you've been working on, where do you think we can focus political change in this? And I know you sort of just said you can't because they don't like us.
No, do you know what it is? It's what's really difficult, I think, in terms of political change is the outcomes that the government are going to get from supporting fathers are long-term. So it's going to take a couple of generations to see the change coming through, see the change in the children who've been brought up by more involved fathers. And, you know, a lot of governments aren't that long-term. So it's all about the money. So you have to put it in monetary terms and say, this is what you'll save in terms of, you know, social care, in terms of health care, in terms of, you know, criminal costs, all these sorts of things. This is what you're going to save. Or, you know, the other way of looking at it is, you know, this is how it will empower women, for example. If we get proper shared parental leave, women can go back to work earlier, the gender pay gap gets reduced, women have less of a price on their careers, a tax on their careers. But again, it's all very, very long term. So it's all about, I'm afraid, trying to get those few people in government. You have to grab the right people and try and get them to try and push it through. The problem we're having at the moment is we keep on getting people and then they lose in the next election. And then we have to go and find another person. But I think it will change because the pressure is starting to build from fathers. I think this younger generation of fathers are different even to their dads, in terms of how they view being a dad, how important it is, what they're willing to give up in terms of career stuff to be with their children. But it is really difficult, particularly, I think, lower down the socioeconomic scale. You know, at the top, there's lots of London law firms giving dads equal paternal rights and all that thing as an enhanced package, and that's lovely. That's wonderful. But it's when we can actually get that for the guy who works in Tesco's that we will have won.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, there is I come from a HR background, in case anyone wondered why I'm saying this, but there is shared parental leave, and I saw when that came in 2016, and to be honest, it didn't make a blind bit.
No.
Only 2% of fathers can actually afford.
And can I just say what gets me is then they say fathers don't want to care for their children. That is not the reason why it hasn't worked. The reason why it hasn't worked is they have not funded it.
Correct. Agreed.
Yes.
So yeah, I guess grassroots, starting with the people around you, start small, and then it will gather momentum. In effect.
Can I just add as well, it's about pushing for a different kind of politics as well, I think. So I use the language of care and compassion in politics. Again, it's a manifesto. There's kind of historical research around people working with an ethics of care in any of their interactions or in the work that they do. And it's trying to encourage that really among all of us in our professional lives, that's where change and transformation happens as well. You know, it might be one small interaction where you say, I'm listening to you, or saying, Dad, here's how you bath the baby, that actually could lead that dad to invest in the lives of their child really effectively and confidently over time, you know. So it's that ethos and that mindset around care and compassion that I think is what will lead to the change. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you very much. That was real clear. I'm trying to group on the fly these questions and I hope it works well. So, wanted to talk about the hormonal changes that you were talking about, Anna, and just for my understanding and for everybody's understanding, before we go on to that, how does your two work interlink? Is yours more about policy change and yours is more about the science of it? Say?
Yes, I'm a scientist, so I spend a lot of time with people in scanners and taking blood off people. But all my work also has a qualitative angle. So because I'm an anthropologist and I come from an ethnographic background, I do all the hard science, but I also always talk to my dads and do papers based upon their experience and stuff like that. And then I suppose I use that to get policy change.
Okay.
That's how it works. I don't work directly
All right,
in sort of sociology and things like that.
Okay, so at the vanguard of policy change through scientific
Yes,
journeys.
evidence.
Good, got it.
Can I add as well? I think what we're doing as researchers and as scientists, I'm a social scientist, is we're trying to explain, but then use and develop knowledge and understanding, but then use that to underpin the activism and the change. So again, it's coming from a very evidence-informed place. It's not just an emotional, lacking in objective approach to what we're trying to do. So, yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, so I was really fascinated by the hormonal change stuff, especially the drop of testosterone and stuff. So one of the questions is, what does the hormonal change look like as the child reaches adulthood and the relationship between them and dad is strained? Is it because they are ready to go out in the world?
Yes, it is. So it's that tension that you get, particularly with teenagers and young adults and their parents, isn't suddenly because dad's suddenly popped up with more testosterone or anything like that. There's no change there. If that testosterone will remain low as long as you remain in contact with your child. So you don't necessarily have to live with your child. In many cultures around the world, dads aren't co-resident, but we still see the drop and we still see the permanent drop because they spend time interacting with their children. So that will remain in a man, and actually then you get the age-related testosterone drop as well, so there's no chance. No, the reason why you get attention is because of that shift of attachment from mum and dad to peers. And so in a way, the child has to shove their parents away to enable them to shift that attachment to their peers and to a different group. You've also got to take into account that teenagers go through massive brain changes. There is a lot of dewiring and rewiring. We're finding that out more and more. I've got a colleague who does that, of what is happening in the teenage brain. So that's why you start to get that tension. And that child is becoming someone who's really trying to understand their identity. And to be able to do that, there's going to be a bit of conflict.
They're sort of coming to themselves by
they're becoming themselves. And they're not becoming an appendage of you anymore. They're going to become their independent being, and that's why it can be difficult.
Anna, did you have anything to add to that? Or?
All I can think of is I've got a preschooler and a child who's 10. And I keep telling my husband not to do rough play, and I'm going to stop that.
No, that's very important.
I feel very seen as a parent.
Thank you. All right, hopefully I'm trying to get this done. Okay, so we are told that only mums can biologically adapt and bed share safely. Does this research indicate that actually men adapt just as well?
Yeah, I was saying earlier that, we all have this idea that, this mantra that mums are instinctive and dads don't have that biological head start. I would say, from my research, mums and dads are identically instinctive and identically have absolutely no clue what they're doing. So it's a steep learning curve for men and women, but they both have an equal biological instinct. So they're both starting from the same place. The only slight difference, I suppose, is because of the flood of hormones that occurs with particularly childbirth, mum does have a slight head start on the bonding front because of that, from the neurochemical bonding point of view, but dads catch up pretty quickly. So the question is about safe sleep.
You're saying dads are biologically the same as mums?
In terms of being primed to parent. Obviously, they're not biologically exactly the same, but.
I'm saying that unless that's in relation to safe sleep, if they have to go in a deeper sleep.
I'm not sure there's much research on that. It's not an area that I'm specialised in, so I couldn't really comment. I don't know what the research is on that, I'm afraid, sorry.
Sorry, just to addend on to that, I think you've got a question over there just to add on.
You talk about hormones as a sort of mums being better prepared. Is there any research that compares mums who go through adoption and dads who go through adoption?
What what happens with mums and dads who go through adoption is they kind of have the same profile as a dad. So because mum doesn't, again, go through this massive physiological change, again, it's about interaction. So mums then sort of take on the having to build one through interaction role in the same way that a father would, a biological father would. Yeah. But, it's a really powerful way. Interaction is the main way that the human brain will change. It really, really doesn't matter the genetic related bit, the pregnancy bit, really that much. It's all about interaction. The human brain is very plastic and open to experience.
Okay. I'm going to be honest, guys. I've sort of lost my trying to get everything together, but I'll do my best. Okay, so... okay, here one. So how do the benefits of having a present father, as explained in your session, outweigh the negative impacts of having a father that may be violent or abusive? Is it better for the father to be involved or not?
Do you know what? That is a really difficult question. In my other area of work, I do actually study abusive relationships. It's really, really hard. And a dad doesn't benefit a child just by being biologically related to it, no. What benefits the child is the dad doing the job as it should be done. So I think it's a real balance of risks. If that father is neglectful towards that child or abusive towards that child or whatever, then I think there's a real question mark as to whether they should be involved. What I would say is you need to look into that child's life and see what other male figures there are. Because biological dads don't have to be the dad. What the child needs is a dad. And that can be a grandfather, it can be an uncle, it can be an elder sibling. So in some cases, circumstances, it can even be not in a major way, but a teacher. So actually, with those children, where the risk is too great, it's not about how the hell am I going to get this child to interact with this biological father, who actually is going to do them huge damage. It's actually about where's the other father? Where are the other fathers in that child's life? I think is what you should focus on. It's a really difficult balance. And there is no black and white answer to it. It's about assessing risk and assessing, okay, let's look at the different ways the dad can input into their lives. Do they have any chance of building a secure attachment to that child? Is there any chance? Are they actually interacting in a sensitive way? Because we know that insensitive parent, neglectful parent, abusive parenting is going to do far more damage to that child than that dad just being present. So you don't get to be present just because you happen to have some genes involved, I don't think.
Incidentally, that's exactly what my book, Fathering in Poverty, says. So the project I did before this one was Men, Poverty and Lifetimes of Care, and I looked at men in impoverished circumstances who were stepping up to provide care for children. So I interviewed male kinship carers, I interviewed young dads and also single fathers, and they were encountering systems all the time that were telling them that because they were men, they weren't going to be capable of caring for that child. And particularly in the case of kinship care, actually men were being turned away as potential carers, even though they were family members, on the basis that they were male and could present a risk. And very often we do use risk resource language in our encounters with fathers. And the book really cautions against that as much as they're in impoverished circumstances, that doesn't automatically make them a risk. No. And that's what we're really trying to push back on.
Massive assumptions that are made, which are not actually based on any evidence at all.
Like unconscious bias.
Yeah, it's infuriating.
Feeling. I feel that maybe...
Yeah, sorry, that's not good enough.
Yeah, it's not really, is it? It really isn't. Okay, so again, looking at the absence of fathers, how can early years practitioners working in education support those children who are struggling with language development and executive function?
It depends upon the level of difficulty with the child. Language development is something which begins very, very early on. So if by the time you've got the kid in a preschool and they're struggling, obviously you're kind of playing catch up quite strongly in terms of how I'm not a language specialist, and you'd have to talk to a linguistic specialist about it. But there are ways of intervening at preschool in terms of language development and in terms of executive function. What is wonderful, again, about the child's brain, and what I always find astonishing when I meet adults who, for example, have had neglectful childhoods but actually have come through, is there are moments of sensitivity in a child's brain throughout their life where the brain is more plastic than it normally would be. Now, we have this mantra that First 2 years are really important, and then it's kind of a suggestion that you shut the door, and there we go, you've got this formed child, and if it's had issues, there's nothing you can do. Actually, there are. Preschool is one of those moments. Around the age of 5, at the entry to primary school, the human brain, for some reason, has another very plastic moment where you can intervene. And again, that's helpful if, for example, the child has insecure attachments, which have affected brain development. You can then, at that point, try and work with the child to help them rewire the brain. Again, it happens again at puberty. And it happens again very briefly at young adults. So when we deal with people who, for example, have attachment disorders or, for example, have developmental disorders associated with things like lack of executive function or executive function that isn't fully formed, we do it at those stages. But I'm not a specialist linguist, so I can't tell you exactly what to do with language or executive function, but just be aware that the door does not shut at the age of 2. And that we can carry on intervening with those children and helping them deal with maybe some of the issues that have occurred because they haven't had sensitive parenting or because they haven't formed a secure attachment. So I'm not a specialist in those areas, though, sorry.
I was just thinking about how that translates again into practice, really. You know, there are lots of examples where practitioners contact mum first if the child's ill, or you know, dad might be named as the primary caregiver, or another male family member, and you know, those interactions again reinforce this idea around the fact that dad maybe is less important. So what professionals could do is think about, well, what are the wider resources for that child in the family and or you know, in their broader support networks, and sort of reach out to and draw on those as well, and think about that broader family context. And you obviously all work, you know, in a kind of more of a whole family context approach. All of that's really significant as well, I think, in how we address those kind of more biological processes.
Yeah, no, I agree, and in fact, you know, the next step for us in fathers research is actually to start looking at a more family-focused network. So at the moment, we've just worked with fathers and children, but actually we need to bring in the other players now and see how all of that interacts together, because actually we're not looking at it realistically. We had to start from first principles, but we actually have to now look at that relationship within the context of the wider family and the wider community and see how that works. And I absolutely agree with it's little steps. This is what infuriates me slightly about sometimes things like government, is actually some of the things we need to do to involve fathers and make them feel that they are an equal parent are tiny, tiny things, like a health visitor when they go for the first visit, actually just saying to dad, how are you? How are you doing? And do you have any concerns or questions? Would you like to talk to me separately? Because quite often, dad's either completely ignored or he doesn't feel like he can maybe express his own concerns because he's being the rock in the room, and he just needs to be given that space. So it's little tiny things like that. Or it is, you know, not just ringing mum first off, or not saying when, you know, dad takes the baby for vaccination, oh, is mum working today? No, I'm here because I'm a parent and I'm taking my child for a vaccination. And that's a perfectly normal thing to do. So it's those kind of, those biases which they don't take much, really. It's not expensive.
Can I add as well? I mean, this is where knowledge, I talked about knowledge in the father inclusion slide, but if you think about Western societies, it was industrialisation that meant that we were thought about in families as kind of a nuclear family, so mum, dad and child. And that ideology and that kind of organisation of society has continued over time, and it's actually shaped how we think about parents and their roles. So again, those kind of social and cultural processes feed into and shape all of these biases or ideas that we have. And again, that's where research and that knowledge can be really helpful as a starting point for addressing that bias, addressing that those myths, and then starting from a more informed place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I'm keeping an eye on time, and I know we've got 5 minutes and about 8 questions. So that breaks down to 40 seconds each, and I don't think I'm going to do them all, and I profusely apologise to anybody that I've missed. However, if I don't get to your question, please do try and find, if that's okay with you guys. Yeah. Is that all right? Yeah, I feel awful. Sorry about that. Okay, so I think we've got a lot of... we've had a number of questions about abusive fathers, actually, and who don't have contact with the child. So I think we've sort of covered off how we balance that, including dads in children's care plans. You sort of covered that off. I think I'm really sorry. I can't see who asked the actual question, but I'm making an executive decision to just bring that in as sort of answered that same thing there. So To both speakers, how do you engage with and collect evidence from those dads from a wide range of ethnic and minorities?
Could I just go back to the previous question really
Yeah, I'm
quickly?
sure
Really
that maybe I
quickly.
shouldn't answer the question
Yeah.
without asking the
No,
experts.
it's fine.
regarding
It's just a really important question, and I'm really conscious that you know, we might make assumptions about involving dads on the basis that they are all positive for their children, and there are men out there who are violent, and I want to just read a quote really quickly because I think this is really important, and this is a key again to a strengths-based approach. So men who use violence need to be held accountable and they need to change. Holding men accountable means condemning their violence while offering them opportunities to change, and again I think that's a core part of this so what approach, that if we ignore those men, they go on and they risk perpetuating that violence continually, potentially with different partners. But again, if we bring dads into the work much earlier, then in theory we can work with those men and we can encourage them into behavioural change programmes and do that work. And that is a strengths-based approach. So we mustn't shy away from violence, I think, as practitioners and as professionals. I think that's a core thing to say.
No, I agree. And actually there are things, there are services, I think there's one starting in Nottingham called Remedy, who have a project called Cease. I know somebody that is part of that. And actually that is the work they do, is working in domestic abuse situations, talking with fathers, and actually getting to think, you know, reflect like where are you now? Why are you there? Is this what you want for your child? How are you going to make that difference? I think it's a really important part of being a inverted commas good dad is reflecting on your own behaviour.
Yeah.
You're not always going to be perfect every day, kind of thing. But if you reflect on it, you can at least try and make some small changes. And there are big changes that needs to be happens if you're violent and abusive towards your children. It's genuinely because something's happened to you too that you need to work through also. So definitely, if it's a care and basically a trauma-based methodology of making sure people get the support they need, you would be looking at that and not ignoring it and just go, well, you're violent, go away, bye. There's no reason you just happened to rain on you one day and then you became violent. That's not how it works. So, no, great point. Thank you. Okay. Oh, yeah, I'm one of them, aren't I? How could I forget? Oh, no.
Conversation and take over a little bit there. So we actually, with the North East Young Dads and Lads, we did a co-research project on this very question. So the North East Young Dads and Lads are Gateshead based, and the community there is, statistically speaking, majority white. But the organisation really felt that they weren't doing enough to engage with minority ethnic communities. So we trained some young dads as part of the charity who were beneficiaries to do co-research, to go out there and find out what communities were actually there in the, in the locality and in the region, and to map that out. To ask professionals about their views of engaging inclusively with different communities, and also we researched with some young dads from those communities as well. And essentially there's a lot of similarities, as you might expect, particularly around, supporting dads is about supporting everybody, and supporting them and taking the work to them in a particular way. But I think what was really core was that community knowledge, and mobilising that community knowledge. So creating an understanding of the support environment that already exists in the region was really helpful. It helped with signposting, so where Needle felt they couldn't necessarily support with a particular issue, particularly if it was around particular cultural challenges or just particular cultures, they were able to signpost and or work with those professionals collaboratively. And again, it's all about that collaboration, I think. It's about knowing your locality and your region, but also just working with people on their own terms as people, listening to them, listening to their challenges, but also listening to the resource that they bring to the parenting relationship as well. And that was all really key to that research. I can provide, we've got reports on that as well if anyone's interested in that, and I can share those with you after the event.
I mean, in terms of when we recruit, I mean, we're slightly different because we're studying things like hormones and brains, and we don't see differences based upon ethnicity, sexuality, anything like that particularly. So, but we do make a big effort to recruit across ethnicities and also across age ranges, because obviously you can be a father from 12, 13, 14 up to well, if you're Mick Jagger, 80-something. We haven't quite had one that old, but I think our oldest dad was 58. So we do make it, and we do a lot of recruiting, again, with organisations, sort of father organisations around us. We actually do quite a lot of media stuff, so we're quite adept at going on the local radio and doing things like that. We put calls out on things like Twitter, but it's very good to partner with local organisations to try and actually recruit people that way. Because sometimes dads can be quite shy about coming forward, particularly also because I stick needles in them, so that's not very nice. But we do tend to find, actually, what's lovely, actually, compared to my other work, is once I've got those dads there, I get very little dropout. And I think that's because it's, for the first time, for quite a lot of them as fathers, they're being focused on, and actually they want to share with their experience, because nobody actually usually asks them.
No one cares.
So, you know, actually, I think I've lost over the years maybe 2 or 3 dads from a study, whereas usually you'll get quite a big dropout rate, so that's what.
Sign me up.